recently on Channel 4, and I did make the offer of perhaps renouncing citizenship, and I think if a lot of Muslims were offered that, you'd see a huge migration of Muslims from this country to the caliphate.
No, and as soon as they got there...
No, you wouldn't.
Well, hang on, Miriam, address Obu directly. Why don't you think?
Religion, and here comes along a religion most people are unused to in this country, and we don't know how to discuss it. We'd rather not. The fact is there are some very uncomfortable things which Muslims globally have to deal with and have to globally have that internal discussion about, and we do not, I think, help that process if we say it has nothing to do with the Quran, nothing to do with Muhammad, nothing to do with Islam. It does a little bit, and or a major bit in some people's beliefs. It has something to do with that, and it's very important not to ignore that, because only by dealing with that can you actually take on the extremists.
You're about to watch Douglas Murray state nothing but bold facts and the actuality of British Islamic extremists. He asserts incontrovertible facts, leaving the Muslim politicians speechless. The heated exchange between Douglas Murray and the rest of the panelists is about the Quran, Prophet Muhammad, and primarily about the British Islamic extremists who potentially engage in attacks and bombings in Western Europe.
Starting with you, because you've studied this, how far is this message of fighting for a caliphate, an Islamic state, spreading within British Muslim youth?
I think the message is quite well established, actually, in large parts of the country, particularly amongst the young people. That's a message that we've heard for about 2 decades, that there needs to be a caliphate, and that this caliphate should be very austere, very narrow, very fundamentalist. And unfortunately, there are young people today who are seeing an opportunity to establish that caliphate, to realise that vision in parts of Syria and Iraq, who are now motivated to go out there and to try and be part of this. And I think in this context, it's very, very important to say, if we look at people who went out to Syria maybe 18 months ago, when we spoke to them, our centre contacts them, we try and understand their motivations for doing so. Their primary thing they were saying to us was that they were going to help the people, that they were worried about women and children, that they were worried about the oppression of civilians. When we talk to them now, either those same people or people who are going out much more recently, that narrative has completely been lost. They're saying we're here to establish an Islamic state. We don't care what the local people say. The land doesn't belong to them, it belongs to God. So you're seeing a much more hardline, much more callous attitude emerge.
Oh, so why that change, Douglas?
Shiraz Meher talks about how the British Islamic extremists who moved to Syria have changed the key tenet they believed in before moving. He says that this is due to the influence of the leader, otherwise known as the caliphate, which means a leader who voices for the group, creates laws that need to be established, and subsequently forms a government that serves the Muslim territories and empires. He admits that the extremist motto was pure. To begin with, they were mere people moving to Syria to help their brethren, women, and children who suffer. However, over time, their way of perceiving things altered. He says they eventually turned unsympathetic and cold-hearted due to the environment. Let us now see Douglas's opinion on this one.
Well, part of it has got to do with the type of people going out there and the type of people attracted to it. There is always a certain type of person, the ideological component aside, there's always a certain type of person who relishes sadism and brutal violence. And
but this message particularly seems to be getting hold, or as you're saying, they've been supporting a caliphate for a very long time,
yeah.
but this is different.
Well,
Why?
yes. I mean, in the 1990s, for instance, when there was a lot of talk about this among some extreme fringe groups in the UK, like Hizb ut-Tahrir, it seemed like an impossible achievement. I mean, they always said that they wanted to make a worldwide Islamic state, but the striking thing in recent months is that the announcement that the Islamic State, the caliphate, has been put together has actually made that, what we all thought was a complete fantasy, into a kind of reality which they can join.
Douglas Murray boldly proclaims that this is due to certain types of people who are intrigued by violence and someone who enjoys barbarity. Although it sounds anomalous, what Murray says is an irrefutable truth. These individuals are deeply motivated by an ideology predominantly established by the caliphate and view it as their religious duty to support this cause. This indeed sounds like a borderline dictatorship.
It's a message, Miriam, because now they can see that there is an Islamic state which is gaining hold. Do you think that's the reason for some turning to the message?
I think IS, first of all, I don't think we should do it the favour of calling it an Islamic state. I think that plays into very much the image that
they
like
call
to
themselves
portray.
Islamic State,
Exactly.
but they don't have one yet.
No, and I would say that, I'll refer to them as IS, but I mean, IS is a product of a political reality, not an ancient religion, and it's quite clear that when you look at the profile
many of the young men who head out there, they are what one report refers to as religious novices. If you look at the 2 books that were ordered by the 2 Brahmins recently who were convicted, they were Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies. Quite clearly, these young men are not religiously literate.
So why are they doing it then?
Well, first of all, I think Shiraz pointed out quite rightly that the Syrian conflict cannot be underestimated in terms of the motivation here. There are a lot of young people who feel extremely frustrated by the Syrian conflict, by the hundreds and thousands of people who are being killed there, and the impotence that many people feel. If you combine that with a situation in which a number of young people in this country feel politically disenfranchised, marginalised, let's look at the profile of some of these young men. They're coming from Portsmouth, they're coming from Cardiff, they're coming from Aberdeen. They're not investment bankers from Chelsea, let's face it. These are guys who are either unemployed or working in
But
Primark.
you're saying that poverty is
to
drawing
find-
them to this message?
I think poverty and alienation absolutely
Well,
provide the structural factors which draw people to messages, radical messages.
Extremists who move to another country for whatever motive are purely not affected by religion, but are only influenced by politics and the ongoing internal affairs in the territories. However, it come to light after various polls and research that fringe groups and extremist groups indeed seek validation from their holy book, the Quran, Hadith, and the implemented Sharia laws. She also mentions how fiscal turmoil can potentially cause them to move to another country and serve as they pay the extremists and jihadists. Well, even though the economic downturn is a reason, it is apparent that this alone is not the cause.
Somebody who is a young Muslim man who does support the idea of a caliphate created by Islamic State. His name's Abu Ramasai, and he joins us from our London newsroom. Why do you support IS?
Well, I don't think it's a question of myself just supporting the Islamic State or the Caliphate or Khalifa Ibrahim Hafidhullah. What I can say is that Muslims, they cherish the Quran and the Sunnah, and for over 90 years we have been living without a caliphate, and many of the rules within the Quran can't be implemented. So now that we have this caliphate, I think you'll see many Muslims globally seeing it as an opportunity for the Quran to be fully realised and for justice to prevail everywhere.
Do you allow the Quran to be fully realised by murdering those who won't convert, by beheading journalists?
Well, I'd say in reply to that there are a lot of lies being pushed out by the BBC and generally the media.
So you believe it's a lie that Christians and Yazidis have been murdered by Islamic State fighters?
Well, I think it's been largely exaggerated, and I think that's been disclosed by the general media. I would say that it's the policy of the Islamic State to cater for and to protect non-Muslim citizens. It's not in their interests to massacre non-Muslims.
But
yes,
they're doing it, though, aren't they? You'd agree that they're doing it?
I agree. Yes, we are seeing a conflict. We are seeing people die. We are in the middle of a global war. And we are seeing people who are fighting the Islamic State, whether they're Shia, whether they're Sunni, or whether they are Christian or whatever other denomination. But I think it's very absurd to say that on one hand, that it's not allowed for people to defend themselves against brutal airstrikes being launched by America and being supported by the British. I mean, why are you not saying that British soldiers are being radicalised to go over to Iraq and Syria and to kill Muslims? Why are they not disenfranchised?
Could I ask, were you born here? You grew up here?
Yes,
went
I was
to
born
school
here.
with people of all denominations.
Mm-hmm.
Then why do you hate them so much?
Well, as a Muslim, I would like to see Britain governed by the Sharia. That's not because I want to oppress non-Muslims, but I believe it's far superior to democracy.
But as we don't have Sharia law,
is better.
We don't have Sharia law in this country. Do you still consider yourself British?
Well, I call myself Muslim, and I don't really identify myself with British values. I'm Muslim first, second and last. And I hope one day, and I invite all non-Muslims listening to this message to embrace Islam and follow the final messenger, Muhammad. And I would as well say, don't believe many of the lies that are being pushed out about the caliphate, about Khalifa Ibrahim, because many of them are not true. I mean, we're getting a lot of conflicting reports. The other month.
This Muslim activist proceeds to put out some extreme claims regarding Muslims, extremist groups, and the Sharia laws. He affirms support for the ISIS group and says it is high time for people to finally realize how important the Quran is and how much it can implement value to various things and aspects of life. If the Muslims prioritize Sharia laws and the Quran, do they also implicitly endorse beheading and stoning non-Muslims and apostates to death? Even after various cases of such incidents, this Muslim activist chose to say that such claims are wildly exaggerated. Even though reaching an agreement on this claim is difficult, the facts do not align with it.
As here, and I mean, how would you respond to that sort of message from Abu, and how many people does he speak for when he speaks like that?
Well, he represents an incredibly tiny minority of people. The difference between him and the sorts of fighters we see going out is that they're not content with sitting around in TV studios espousing these opinions. They've actually got up and gone. In many cases, we've seen women get up and go as well. So he's just really someone who's had a very long history of kind of radical activism and spouting these kinds of very inflammatory opinions, but doesn't actually walk the walk when it comes down to it. The people who are far more dangerous are the people who actually associate with men like him, who are on the peripheries of the networks that men like him activate in. So, and much younger in some
younger
cases.
and irresponsible.
Yes. Right. Yes. Though, is some understanding of why some British young Muslims are listening to the IS voice and want to go over and fight there, and what can be done to stop it?
Could I just quickly, I mean, of course this is a young men issue. I mean, I think Dag's chronicled every single person in the US and UK who's been convicted of terrorism-related offences in this regard in the last 15 years. The overwhelming majority are young men. Of course we're dealing with young men. But you can't then ignore the fact that for them, whether you like it or not, whether we like it or not, for them, an interpretation of Islam is the reason that they are doing this. Now, you know, for us, this is the most appalling interpretation of Islam. For Muslims, it's the worst possible interpretation of Islam. But it is an interpretation, and that's why, you know, although it's more convenient for us to pretend that this has nothing to do with Islam, we do have to accept that it does in order for Muslims and others to fight against the interpretation that people like those in ISIS and indeed your loony guest here have, you know,
I don't think anyone's denying.
Douglas Murray strongly puts the fact out, saying that even though it is difficult to agree that religion plays a crucial role in such extremist groups, that is the undeniable truth. Quran and Hadith is a form of interpretation they believe and trust and use to ratify their actions and intentions, and I fully agree with Murray on this one.
There's a misinterpretation of Islam that
well,
people
an interpretation,
like.
well, it's a misinterpretation,
Fine,
not
fine.
interpretation.
An interpretation by a fringe group is being spread. Absolutely, no doubt, and I don't think anyone's denying that. I think the critical issue is...
Hang on, let Miriam finish her point.
I think, broadly speaking, there is an acceptance that an interpretation of Islam is being used to justify a certain politicised message. But I think the key issue here is whether or not that sort of cultural explanation is the predominant explanation. And I would say, actually, what we're looking at is what are the factors which encourage young men to get involved in any sort of crime or criminality, be that gangs or jihadism. And those factors tend to be linked to alienation, to poverty,
if I can just very quickly, I mean, every single young person at some point in their life feels alienation, feels disenfranchisement. Most people feel left out at some point, Miriam. I mean, most young people at some point. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And the problem we have in this country is that there is a large echo chamber of people who want to play into that perceived set of grievances. Let me give you one very quick example. Western foreign policy. We hear all the time, and your loony guest here just did it, the fact that British forces have been engaged in the Middle East is a reason for radicalisation. Let me put it this way. In the 1990s, we didn't get involved in the Balkans. And then we did. I have never heard one Muslim leader in this country say how much we are grateful to NATO for intervening in the Balkans and saving Muslim lives. In other words, the West is at risk. The West is at risk of being
intervention or non-intervention,
but the West is at risk of being blamed when we intervene and when we don't.
I know, and what we're trying to get to now is, and we'll talk about what the government's plans are as well to do things within law and strengthen the law here in just a second. I want to go back to Abu and ask whether you've thought, as you don't identify with Britain or British values, whether you've thought about handing in your passport.
Well, I did give an interview recently on Channel 4, and I did make the offer of perhaps renouncing citizenship, and I think if a lot of Muslims were offered that, you'd see a huge migration of Muslims from this country to the caliphate.
No, and as soon as they got there... No, you wouldn't.
Well, hang on, this Muslim activist asserts yet another impractical fact, saying there would be a huge amount of Muslim migration off the country if they were to renounce their citizenship in the UK. However, this claim is preposterous, considering the amount of Muslim immigrants each year in the UK. Does this Muslim activist...
Address Abu directly, why don't you think?
Sorry, well, I mean, no, you wouldn't see a mass exodus of Muslims.
Well, can I make a comeback on that?
You might
can
see,
I make a comeback
hang on, no, let Miriam make her point, and then you can come back on
you might see one or two individuals, but I'm not even sure that this gentleman here would leave himself.
Would you leave, Abu?
Of course, I mean,
It's
if
too
I had a safe
comfortable.
passage to the
Don't you?
caliphate, I'll be
Why
the first
don't
one on the
you?
plane to go to the caliphate and live there.
But why
The
don't you?
The sad reality is that the British
Why
government
don't you?
are
We'll
implementing
do a whip
oppressive
around.
policies,
Go on.
and they're arresting many Muslims at airports and preventing them from going to the caliphate.
But
So
I think-
that is an issue that needs to be rectified.
There is one.
Hang on. That's my view.
There is one important point here, which is the broader issue of whether taking away citizenship does assist in these matters. And I think the key issue is we don't actually assist the matter by pretending it's not our problem. By taking away somebody's British citizenship, what are we saying? Oh, they're not British, it's not our problem. No, we need to recognise that there are disaffected members of British society who do need to be reinserted into broader,
and you've made that
fabric
point
of
very clear.
society.
Blacks and poor white boys. So
Everybody.
Okay, so it comes back to the point I just made about interventionism and about this country's foreign policy. There is such a wellspring of lies out there, which in the mainstream media and all sorts of places about what this country and our allies do. A very, very large wellspring of lies. It is very easy for young people of any political or religious background to seize on that and feel some kind of added resentment because of it. So we have to make sure that the narratives of what this country actually does, what this country actually is, are much better got out there.
Okay, Shiraz, is it all?
Winston just did it earlier on, is the thing of, because it's so uncomfortable, we don't want to have the discussion. Our societies are no longer very good at discussing religion, and here comes along a religion most people are unused to in this country, and we don't know how to discuss it. We'd rather not. The fact is there are some very uncomfortable things which Muslims globally have to deal with and have to globally have that internal discussion about. And we do not, I think, help that process if we say it has nothing to do with the Quran, nothing to do with Muhammad, nothing to do with Islam. It does, a little bit, or a major bit in some people's beliefs. It has something to do with that, and it's very important not to ignore that, because only by dealing with that can you actually take on the extremists. Otherwise, a young man like your lunatic guest earlier is very likely to have been told by people there's nothing in the Quran to justify this violence. He finds a verse given to him by an extremist that shows the behead the unbeliever, and then he thinks all these other people are lying to me. We have to take on things to stop that happening.
So we have to hear the voices.
Douglas Murray is completely right on this one. Fringe groups undeniably have a lot to do with religion. And in fact, the claims made by some panelists earlier evidently show how some are too uncomfortable to openly accept reality, which is not hidden or confined to anyone. Do you think Douglas Murray was right about the assertions? Share your opinions in the comments below. For more of Douglas Murray's heated debates on various topics, be sure to check out our channel.